said that he had seen his parents afraid and powerless in Lungur, and that this was tantamount to their absence. Another profound estrangement came after the war, when Ballard returned to his alleged homeland, the island which he would be cast away on for the remainder of his life.
We docked at Southampton. We'd come in a former refrigerated meat vessel called the Arawa, which had been converted to a troop ship during the war. And we docked at Southampton, and I remember looking down at this very, very grey light, and these tired little streets, which were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And I think when you move from a northern latitude to a southern, or from a southern to a northern, you immediately notice the difference in light. Everything seemed very grey, and these little side streets were lined with strange sort of black perambulators, which I thought were some sort of mobile coal scuttle used for bunkering ships. In fact, they were English cars. I went to school in Cambridge as well, and then I went on to the university to become a medical student. I don't know, I mean, there's no doubt that Cambridge was and is still a great university, but with great strengths, of course, in scientific research. At the same time, I felt the university was a kind of Gothic pageant. It was a theme park before its day, nostalgia and a dream of English life that had gone forever.
Originally, I wanted to become a psychiatrist, and I think it was a case, really, of physician heal thyself. Psychiatry seemed one way of coming to terms and maybe understanding what all this was. And to become a psychiatrist, I had first to become a doctor. So I spent 2 years as a medical student, cutting up cadavers. I think every medical student can remember the first moment walking into the dissecting room with a strange cross between a butcher's shop and a nightclub. It was quite jolting, even though I'd seen a great number of dead bodies. To see them actually laid out under this strange light in this rather theatrical way on these glass tables. And in those days, they were a faintly green colour as a result of the formalin. The strange thing to me is that, I think this is true, they don't actually look like the dead. They look like visitors from another planet. As you begin the process of dissection, you enter, literally, and mentally and imaginatively, into the bodies of these dead men and women.
As the 4 student teams began to dissect this unknown woman, opening flaps of skin in her limbs, neck and abdomen, she seemed to undress in a last act of self-revelation, unpacking herself of all the mortal elements in her life. Sitting beside her, I pared back the skin of her shoulder, dividing the muscles and exposing the nerves of her brachial plexus, the strings that had once moved her arms as she caressed her husband, brushed her hair, cradled her child. I tried to read her character in the scars beneath her chin, traces perhaps of a car accident, the once broken bridge of her strong nose and the mole on her right temple, which she may have disguised with a handsome blonde wave. Pretending to read my Cunningham, the dissection handbook whose pages were now stained by the dead woman's skin, I stared at her matronly hips and at the calluses on her left fingers, those of an amateur cellist. As we opened the doors of her body, students and demonstrators working on other cadavers would pause behind us, drawn to this solitary woman among the dead men. She alone was treated to none of the lewd dissecting-room humour.
Ballard once described his fictional method to me as essentially forensic, that he would locate an object, say a sheet, then observe a human trace on it, a lipstick or a semen stain, then try to imagine the events that had caused it. But his writing was a form of dissection as much as detection. And while he abandoned his medical studies to train as a pilot, Ballard's prose, although capable of poetic flights, always remained rooted in the bodily and the visceral.
I mean, I accept the sort of idea that flight is a sort of symbol of escape, but I think more of an escape of transcendence. It's played a very large role in my fiction. My characters are forever dreaming of runways and looking into those skies where they can transcend themselves, and from which, of course, in the mid and late 20th century, life and death come in terms of nuclear weapons. I think I was assembling a kind of mythology for myself.
At dusk, Shepard was still sitting in the cockpit of the stranded aircraft, unconcerned by the evening tide that advanced towards him across the beach. Tirelessly, the dark night water sluiced its luminous foam at the Florida shoreline, as if trying to rouse the spectral tenants of the abandoned bars and motels. But Shepard sat calmly at the controls, thinking of Elaine, his dead wife, and all the drained swimming pools of Cocoa Beach.
For me, one of the most inspiring aspects of J G Ballard's work, and I count him as a major literary influence, was that while other post-war English writers remained interned in their Hampstead camp, putting on amateur dramatics about adulterous affairs, Ballard embraced the most significant technological changes of the 20th century, radical surgery and powered flight, with the same reckless abandon with which he had embraced Shanghai as a small boy. He said that the 1960s was a fascinating decade that I mostly watched on television. But back in the 1950s, he had already seen the naked truth of the emergent world, bathing in the greenish glow of atomic anxiety.
I felt that the so-called mainstream novel in the mid-1950s, when I was beginning to become a writer, simply didn't reflect the world that I saw around myself. I mean, you know, the blueprint for the world we live in now in the 90s was laid down in the 1950s. Jet travel, the consumer society, you know, the TV landscape. And I saw none of this apparent in the fiction of, you know, Anthony Powell and Kingsley Amis and C.P. Snow and so on. I didn't see a single motorway. I didn't see a single airport. I didn't see a single high-tech hospital. I didn't see a single computer. And they were just coming in then. What I saw around me in the London and the England and the Western Europe and the North America that I visited of the mid-1950s was change. Enormous change was taking place, driven by science and technology. I thought any fiction that is about the present day must reflect this powerful engine that was transforming everything. And the only form of fiction that seemed to have a halfway decent chance of doing this was science fiction, most of which I detested because it was all set in the far future or, you know, on the other side of the galaxy. I wanted a science fiction set in the present day.
It was during a stint in Canada, learning to fly with the RAF, that Ballard first absorbed the new American science fiction writing. And when he returned to London, he became the editor of a small scientific journal. He also began to write his own science fiction stories. Paradoxically, this time of imaginative adventure was counterbalanced by the first real domesticity he had experienced since childhood.
I think I was looking for peace, in a way. Not that a young married life was very peaceful, but I think I realized that if I was to become a writer, I needed to sort of settle myself down, and I needed to measure my own past and my own imagination against the sort of basic yardsticks of marriage, human emotions and relationships, children, childbirth.
Miriam frowned at the headboard, concentrating as she waited for the next contraction. Panting, she clenched her fists. God, Jesus, my piles are killing me. I knelt down and placed my hand between her buttocks, pressing my fingers against her swollen anus. The bloated lining of her rectum ballooned outwards, and I pushed the spongy cushion into her anus, then held it there as the last contractions came. One last push. It's coming now, another push for the head. Miriam's vulva had expanded, and the crown of her minute head had appeared between her legs. The black hairs were moist and neatly parted, as if a thoughtful nature had groomed the child for its first appearance in this world. Push now, we're almost there. The whole face had emerged. A high forehead,